Well, good evening, everyone. It's Tim Meyers here. I'm the principal at Melbourne School of Theology and Eastern College, and welcome to our open week. It's not the final session of the week. There's another couple tomorrow, but it's good of you to join us, especially on a Friday night in lockdown. We hope that this webinar will be encouraging to you. We're talking about leadership in complexity and diversity. Now, just as far as the format of the session goes, this is going to be a conversation rather than just a presentation. There'll be about 40 minutes of conversation with our two guests, who I'll introduce in a moment, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. And you can type those, if you wouldn't mind, in the Q&A box, which you'll see on your screen. As I reflect myself on, 27 years of leadership in various settings, in local church, in non-profit sector, in mission organisations, then in international cross-cultural work, and then eventually here at Eastern and MST. I think one of the challenges facing leaders today is just the sheer diversity of things that come across their desk, complex things and diverse things. It's true in society, it's true in business, it's true in education, it's certainly true in politics, it's true in sport, and it's true in the church. That leadership is almost an immersion in complexity and diversity. So tonight we're going to have our two guests join us who are going to help us reflect on this and explore some aspects of what it means to be a leader in times of diversity and complexity. And there may be various categories that we touch on: culture and tradition, expectations and ambitions of people, worldviews and ethics, political views, theological differences, gender issues. Who knows what will come up, and hopefully you'll find it interesting and encouraging. I'm sure I will as well as we speak with them. So I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves to you. So a welcome to Dr. Kirk Franklin and Dr. Jude Long. Hey Jude, you can hear me okay?
I can, thanks Tim.
Hi Jude, and g'day Kirk.
Hi Tim.
Thank you both of you for joining us in this webinar. A webinar, as you know, that we've called Leadership in Complexity and Diversity. And I know just even saying that will make you smile because it's something that is so familiar to both of you. So we really appreciate you spending some time with us tonight to talk about these things, and we'll take some questions towards the end through the Q&A box. But as a first step, Jude, how about we ask you to introduce yourself, and why might this topic be something that's particularly relevant to you? So tell us a bit about yourself, Jude, and look forward to that.
Thanks very much, Tim. Well, I'm the Vice Principal Academic at MST and Eastern, and the Director of the Eastern Vet RTO. That's a registered training organisation. So that's a little story in complexity of its own. I've been here just in that role since January. I returned to Melbourne just 18 months ago now from Darwin, where I was the principal of Noongalingya College in Darwin. Noongalingya is the Aboriginal Bible college, basically run by the Anglican, Catholic and Uniting churches. So that's obviously quite an interesting story that I'll share a little bit about as we go through this time. I've done other leadership roles. Before I went to Noongalingya, I was actually at the Bible College of Victoria, the predecessor of MST, as the Dean of Students there for 9 years. And that was a really great time of learning about leadership for me. And some of the, I've been involved in leading in different ways in churches over many years in both paid and unpaid voluntary roles as a layperson, not as an ordained person. So that's a very different perspective that you bring to someone who's actually been the minister. It brings challenges, and it's good, but there are some really different things that happen to you as a layperson. So that's a little bit of my story, Tim.
Great. Thank you, Jude. And Kirk, tell us about yourself, mate, and how this topic. Well, you'll get into that as we discuss it a little bit further, but perhaps just a bit about yourself to start with.
Yeah, sure. Well, I've grown up in missions. My parents were missionaries in Papua New Guinea, and my father seemed like from a very young age was always in a leadership role. And if I'm totally honest, in my upbringing, it actually put me off leadership. I saw how much stress and pressure and all. I thought, you know, leading Christians in mission is probably the worst calling you could probably have. And lo and behold, when 40 years ago, when I joined Wycliffe actually as a media guy, in my first assignment in Papua New Guinea, they put me in charge of a whole team of people. And I guess I was thrown in the deep end. And the interesting thing all along for the last 40 years of leadership roles, because there's been many, is that, you know, I turned out I could do it. You know, I must have done reasonably well because I was kept giving more roles. And one of the most interesting ones was been in the last 12 years. This is where complexity really was hitting me hard, and that was leading a global mission agency called Wycliffe Global Alliance, which is actually 100 other organizations that we were trying to hold together from about 80 different countries and cultures. And I guess, you know, from my own journey is that God doesn't give you an assignment like that early on. You've got to go through these other incremental steps. And that included quite often lay leadership roles, even in my local church, whether it was here in Australia or in Melbourne or in Papua New Guinea where I was working. And so interestingly, I guess, even though I had that upbringing where I was really adverse to leadership, probably even in talking to my dad years ago, he said, well, he didn't actually think he was a very good leader. And maybe that was contributing to that family stress I was feeling. But anyhow, since then, it's been quite a journey. I've lived here in Melbourne for the last 30 years. Currently, I've stepped down from the global role, and I'm currently helping at MST, you know, lecturing in missional leadership, but I'm also doing some research and leadership development at a mission center in Oxford, UK, and also doing leadership development research and studies for the Wycliffe Global Alliance, kind of just reflecting on the last 15 or 20 years of leading in the global space.
Mm. Thank you, Kirk. So one of the things that the three of us share in common is a journey of leadership that has taken us specifically into diversity of cultures. And but it's not just about cultures, is it? There's a lot more at play in the layers of complexity in leadership. And Jude, you've got an interesting story because you mentioned you had gone to Nolinga College in Darwin, an Aboriginal college, as a Melbourneite, as a woman, as a white woman, a Caucasian woman, to take on a very difficult assignment in a very eclectic ministry. Tell us about how that sort of came about, Jude, and from that experience, just perhaps an example of where this challenge of complexity and diversity was particularly acute for you in that role you had there.
Yeah, look, it was certainly a surprise to me that that's where God took me. That I always tell the story that I was praying about where I might end up. And when I saw the advertisement for Darwin, I told my husband and he just laughed because I really hate hot weather. So that was certainly a challenge for me in Darwin. But Nolinga was a really interesting place because you had this working together of three denominations, Anglican, Catholic and Uniting. And people would say to me, oh goodness me, how could that possibly work? And it worked for a number of reasons. One was that in the history of mission in the Northern Territory, they basically divided up the Northern Territory into different sections and each church got a bit. So the Methodists got the top end, the Anglicans sort of got a bit down the side, the Catholics down the other side, and the Baptists got the desert, which makes me laugh. And so there was only ever one church in each of the remote communities. And because the remote communities were different cultures and different languages, the denomination actually became like part of that culture and language. So if you were from the Tiwi Islands, you spoke Tiwi and you were Catholic. If you were from Elcho Island, you spoke Jambrapoingal and you were Uniting Church. It was as simple as that. So for the students, there was no issue because it was just part of that cultural diversity. For the staff though, and for the management of the college, that was a whole different story. And we had a representative board with 4 representatives of each of the 3 churches, 2 of which had to be Indigenous. So half the board would be Indigenous. We had staff who came from all sorts of different places. Some of them were Uniting Church ministers, others were Anglican missionaries, others were paid by the church, well, paid by the college, so basically through donations. So you had all this diversity of people working there, and you know, that there was probably more issues managing the diversity of the staff than anything else. You know, we had our moments where we didn't get on. Generally speaking, we could agree about most things. One of the challenges was to what extent should Aboriginal people be encouraged to use their traditional cultural practices as part of chapel worship. So that was quite a challenging thing because the 3 denominations actually had different views on that. And the students, depending which community they came from, had very different views. And so one particular staff member was pushing very strongly that we should have didgeridoo in chapel. But other situations, other communities felt that the didgeridoo, every tone that comes out of a didgeridoo has a spiritual meaning. And they weren't ready to be using something that carried evil spirits, basically, into chapel. And so there was a cultural issue there that became quite difficult, and it then spilled over into a denominational issue and a personal issue between me and that person. So that was probably one example of something we had to navigate.
And Jude, that's a very obvious example, but you've mentioned something there that I'd be interested to ask Kirk about, and that is there's the obvious diversity in the domains within which that ministry is happening. It's working with Aboriginal people, and there's various nations within that community, and they were represented in your college. And I think you mentioned at one point there were well over 20 language groups at any given time. Many Australians wouldn't even realise there are that many Indigenous languages that are extant still in Australia. But you spoke about that aspect of diversity, and there may be some people listening here tonight who won't or haven't yet confronted that sort of ground level cultural diversity. But what we all encounter is the challenge of keeping our teams together, and they are themselves facing differences of views, and they have differences of opinion. And we mentioned earlier the possibilities or just the reality of diversity, even within a local church now. I doubt there'd be a congregation in Australia at a local church level that, if you were to examine it, wouldn't represent different cultures, different backgrounds, different theological traditions, different worldviews, different ethics, different politics. And that presents a challenge for leaders, doesn't it? And so, Kirk, given that both you and Jude and I as well have had leadership in an organisational sense, strongly nuanced by cultural diversity, but the greater challenge, at least that I've found, is the challenge of team leadership within your organisation. And how do you create cohesion and unity, and how do you manage the responsibilities that people have, or that they want and don't have, or that they have and don't want, and their expectations of you as a leader. I say from time to time that the greatest challenge that I found in my leadership life is choosing at any one point the number of people that you might be disappointing. So Kirk, tell us a little bit about perhaps an example in your own life where you're talking about the leadership within your organisation or your team. How do you generate and incubate cohesion in the context of diversity?
Yeah, well, when I started in this global role 13 years ago, 2007, I was getting ready, and I really didn't have a team. I was inheriting a structure internationally that wasn't working, and so I actually was saying to the board of directors that I would dismantle that structure and move it from a very hierarchical office based in the US to a sort of a global flatter structure, team-based, of a multicultural team, diverse with men and women, even age group. It all sounded great, pie in the sky stuff. Boards of directors often love that when they want to see a real massive change take place. But the reality was that I didn't really know who I could find who would step into such a high level role. And these are not paid roles most of the time. People come with their own financial support. What surprised me very quickly was that God had already been working in people's hearts. And so I was able to put together a team over about a 6-month period. But they didn't know each other. They were going to work virtually, and they were from about a dozen cultures. Even though they were well experienced within mission contexts, they didn't necessarily meld together. And so the idea occurred to me that you've got to build trust first. You've got to get to know each other. And many people that I was going to be working with came from relational cultures, from Latin America and Africa and Asia in particular. Us, if we come from a Western background, often we're fairly individualistic, often too much so, and we don't appreciate community. We've got to learn that. And so right from the start, before the team even started, I found some funds and got them all to Singapore, and I included spouses. So if it was the wife was the leader, her husband came, and we basically spent 3 days just getting to know each other, to build trust, to hear each other's stories, and to pray together. Looking back, it was the most brilliant thing I could have ever done. I don't claim credit for it. I'm sure it came from the Lord. But what it did is it solidified the sense of trust. Because from then on, we were going to hit some very turbulent times. We were going to be leading change processes that were going to be dismantling 50 years of institutional structures. We were going to create tensions that were unbelievable at times. And the only way we were going to get through this, as it turned out, was this deep sense of trust. Now, that was okay to start with, but team members, as they do in any case, would rotate off, and someone else would come in, and you had to restart the whole process again. You had to help them meld with this new team. And they, of course, came from other cultures. And some of the most interesting dynamics were when you had a collective of two people from the same culture. Originally, there was a lot of Americans from the United States, and you know what they're like. And of course, I have a US background. They talk too much. They're oral processors, big thinkers, strategic in thinking, think they can change the world. You bring some Koreans in, which I did in Japanese, they would often sit silently in our leadership meetings. The Americans had no clue what was going on. You know, they just kept talking. And pretty quickly we realized, or I realized with the help of these Asian friends and Africans, you know, stop. You know, to the English speakers, the mother tongue speakers of English, stop in a meeting, stop, be quiet. And then, but that didn't work either. And then one Korean brother said to me, you know what we need to do? We all stop, we write our thoughts, and then you ask the non-English mother tongue speakers to go first. Because you guys who are English, you're so familiar with the language, you don't even need to think twice about how to articulate your feelings and your thoughts. But the rest of us need that space. You know, we fundamentally changed our face-to-face meetings and our online meetings based on that. And that showed trust. You know, the moment you start doing things like that, where you're listening to maybe a minority voice, it really does build trust. And it brings that cohesion, that team spirit. And so we were leading that way for 12 years. And as far as I know, the team continues to lead that way because that became the fundamental value. Relationship first, in Christ with each other. That builds the foundation for trust. Then we can pretty much get through anything, even if we don't necessarily agree with each other. So the differences of opinion were also nuanced in culture and theology, but you can actually get through those if the trust is high.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we could do a whole course, couldn't we, Kirk, and conflict management and the nurturing of trust. Jude, I know that as you look back on those years at Nunalinga, and of course now that you're the vice principal here at Eastern College and MST, overseeing 2 schools along with Peter and I, and it has some similarities to you, but it's different. As you look back on those years at Nunalinga, what were some of the lessons you learnt, particularly on account of the diversity that you faced? They may be lessons about yourself. They may be lessons about God and about leadership. What was, as you reflect on that now, that you try to bring into your new leadership role that you've got back here?
I think one of the things I've learned is the importance of prayer, that just praying together with people all the time. You know, it used to be my thing at Nunalinga that you couldn't get out of my office without being prayed for, you know. And I think that was really, really important. One of the challenges was that not all my staff were Christians. But, you know, there was an expectation that whenever we met together, whenever we did anything, whenever we had a staff meeting, we would always start with prayer. We would always finish with prayer. And every lesson would start with prayer and finish with prayer. So I think bringing God into the situation is so important. And, you know, I continue to do that at MST and Eastern. You know, people get up to go, hold on, you know, I want to pray for you before you leave. It's so much harder by Zoom, though, I've got to say. You know, that whole thing of that engaging together with God and bringing him into the conversation at all times. So I think that was something I learned that was really important.
Yeah.
I could say quite a few things, I suppose. Kirk said that relationship was everything. Working with Aboriginal people, relationship is everything. And so they have a whole system of kinship and relationship, and I was adopted into the kinship system. And so part of what you do whenever you meet a group of Aboriginal people is you say what your skin name is, who you're related to, how you all fit together, and then you spend some time working out where your mother's country is and your father's country is. And so you actually spend all this time working out, how am I connected to you? And once you've done that, you go, right, that's okay, now we can talk. And so even at the beginning of every class, we would spend time, at the beginning of each intensive, we taught by intensive, I would spend time with the students working out with them where they came from and how they all connected to each other and what we would call each other, because depending how you related, you had all different names you called each other. And so actually investing time in relationship. In Aboriginal culture, that was very specific. You know, there was a whole structure that you engaged in. I have to say that that's not my best thing, that I'm actually a bit shy, and it's okay with Aboriginal people, but it's probably much harder in a Western context to actually build those relationships and, you know, really get to know people and, you know, I just got muted somehow. Half of my year's been on Zoom, so building relationships is a challenge. But I agree with Kirk. It's just such a core of that leadership. Yeah.
Jude, that's really interesting and helpful for the next question I'd like to ask. And Kirk, I'm going to throw to you for this one. So Jude has identified that the cultural context of her leadership raised questions about the development of trust. But the application of that is true to leadership generally, isn't it? And if you don't have the capacity to get to know people and generate trust, then you're going to have to adopt a style of leadership that ultimately may or may not be effective. Kirk, tell us a little bit about that from your perspective. How do you, because that relationship component as opposed to the fairly pragmatic, well, what have we got to do? In Australian society and Western culture, often when we greet somebody for the very first time, the question that we ask them is their name, and then what do you do? And I grew up in Papua New Guinea where that was the last question anyone would ask. In fact, I remember once when I was in Sudan talking with the leader of a church movement that was well over 3 million strong. And they didn't have any money. They were just, their church office was in a shipping container. It's a persecuted church, obviously, in the Sudan, north and south, and this was in northern Sudan. But this man, who was in his late 80s at the time, had presided over the most remarkable, you'd call it a revival if you were writing church history, but the remarkable growth of the Nuba and northern Sudanese church. Incredibly powerful movement of the spirit in that place. And I finally got to meet this man. I'd read about him, I'd heard about him. He's sort of legendary in African church and mission circles, but a very quiet and a very shy man. So I got to meet him, and his name is Samuel, and I said to him, Samuel, it's a real honor to meet you. I'd love to know, you lead a church of over 3 million baptized believers now, and they're persecuted. What did you do? And he said to me with a glint in his eye, oh, this is a very Western question. And that's all he said. Because, and I knew sort of naturally from my own background in Papua New Guinea that actually it's more about who you are and your family and your family heritage or your tribe and your worldview and it's just a whole different set. Contemporary research demonstrates that actually this generation, millennials, are shifting closer to a collectivist society than at any point in Western history, again. And so what does that say about leadership in diversity? Kirk, do you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, I do. I think, first of all, we have a lot to learn from what the global cultures can teach us, such as your friend in Ethiopia, and I think, or the Aboriginal community, really, or Tim and I growing up in Papua New Guinea. But the problem, I think, is that often in leadership studies, leadership theory, if you do those studies, they give you Western research, pretty much all of it. Is very unusual to find it anywhere else. And so the West is pretty much determined the main leadership schools and theories. And they don't easily allow for this more of an open learning process where it's dialogical. You're building relationships. You're in Ethiopia, you're going through the coffee ceremony that they do, or if you're in Mexico in a little village, you're eating fresh made tortillas and just doing life together. And I think in my observation of people who are schooled more in the maybe Western way of working as things, they want to jump quickly to the outcomes, to the business, to the talk at hand. And that really infuriates or frustrates people who don't come from that culture. But the problem is they're often the most kind and gentle people you could imagine. So they just don't tell you that if you're not really interested in them. So what I guess I've learned, and maybe often the hard way, although my dad's an anthropologist, so he studied people and culture, is that really we have to be a learner of others, their culture, their context. We have to appreciate that. We have to learn from it. It's not all going to be good. It's not going to all be good, something we can even agree with, but we can at least respect it and not come in with this, especially a Western sense of, we know what's best, we know what's right for you. And I think that goes a long way, particularly in this very complex, troubled world we live in because of the, after effects of colonialism, and now we have this rising nationalism where nations are pitted against each other. It's almost like nobody wants to learn from each other anymore. No one wants to listen to each other. And so that would be the space I found very helpful, is just continually wanting to learn. And one of the things when we do that, especially if we come from a very strong Aussie culture, is we're very egalitarian, as you know, and we don't actually like our leaders very much, especially, we want to talk politics, but, there's certain types of leaders that we really do not like. But, you know, you go to other cultures, that's terrible thinking. The chief is respected because the chief looks after the community. So it seems to me we actually have often have flawed leadership theories that we're working off of, assuming it's what's best for God's mission. It's, you know, it's the way it should be done because after all, it's worked. Well, it probably hasn't worked, but we just think it has. So this learning, constant learning, and obviously we don't ditch a lot of the tried and true theories, and practices, but at the same time, I think they've got to learn more from the global arena if we're really going to make a difference as Christ followers, because it's the global church now that's increasingly in charge, even of mission, and we're simply the servants to that church.
And that's actually a good segue, Kirk, and it reminds me to mention that you and I, along with one or two others who'll speak into it, are teaching a unit at the end of the year in missional leadership. And it really raises questions about contemporary leadership in this diverse setting that we're in. And it was just the most encouraging unit last time we taught it, wasn't it? And the diversity of people that participated in that. Some of you that are listening in, you may want to just take a note of that. That's towards the end of the year that we'll be teaching.
It's actually in January, Tim.
Oh, that's right. It is too. Thanks, mate. Yes, one of my leadership gifts, not diary management. Jude, it would be inevitable, and I think really helpful as well, to just run something past you as well, as a female, as a woman in leadership in a bit of a man's world, particularly in the theological space. But not only that, in the cultural diversity that you've experienced, I'd be interested to know from both of you, but Jude, you first, how do you identify and empower and encourage people that may, for some reason or other, including gender, end up knocking up against glass ceilings in the trajectory of leadership development? What would you say to that, Jude? Give us some insights that you've experienced yourself or that you'd like to share.
Well, I think being intentional about thinking outside the box is really, really important. In Aboriginal culture, it's a bit different because it's just really, really different. Yeah. But reflecting on it from my own perspective, one of the things that I guess I've observed over many years is that within the church, young men would be identified, would be groomed, the minister would come alongside them, would give them opportunities, would say, hey, you know, why don't you preach? Or, you know, have you considered doing some study, or, you know, whatever. But very rarely does that ever happen to women. Certainly never happened to me in my life. And so I guess one of the things I think is really, really important is to be prayerfully thinking about who might God be picking, who might God be identifying. Now, that's not to say that every woman or every man is cut out for leadership. We're all different. But God knows, and God calls you into that. But if you had someone walking alongside you and saying, oh, you know, you could maybe do this. When I went to Noongalinga, this is part of the story, I suppose. My husband and I were praying about what we might do next. And I saw the job for principal of Noongalinga, and I went, oh, my husband could do that job. He's got a degree in theology and he's been the principal of a school, you know. It'd be a great job for him, send it to him. And it took a lot of convincing by God that I was the one who should actually apply for that job, not my husband. And I'm very fortunate that I have a really supportive and encouraging husband who said, why don't you do it? You know, what, me? You know, I've never been a principal. How could I do that? But just to have someone even say, why don't you do it? And, you know, maybe I'll be there to support you along the way, you know, which he was really, really important for me.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jude. And I suspect that for all three of us, certainly it was my experience. I would never have anticipated exercising any leadership role when I was young, or even in my early 20s when I was playing music professionally and teaching and doing this and that, I just had no sense of having capacity in leadership. It was others who spoke into my life, and they had to convince me of that. Kirk, you've reflected on that as well. Jude, you've just, nuanced some of your response with that same idea of the generational investment of leadership development, mentoring and encouragement and empowerment, and also providing people with the opportunity to fail. And rather than seeing leadership as a performance and outcome driven thing, but rather a developmental thing for a person as well as the people they end up influencing. The spheres of our leadership ultimately ought to be determined by God, and that becomes a problem when you have ambitious leadership and it's not tempered with humility. And we see that in Scripture. We see it in Jesus. We see it in his discussions with the disciples. And the beneficiaries of investment in discipleship, in character development, in experiences, end up being those that you end up leading. So some of you listening to this seminar may not necessarily be leaders. You are thinking about it, or perhaps you've been tapped on the shoulder by somebody in an organisation or a church or a marketplace setting, and or a school, and you're thinking about leadership. Others are invariably the better observers, and you would hope that that process is prayerful. And particularly, I think, for women, identifying and being deliberate about giving opportunities for women to lead in the organisations that we're in is just so important. So thank you, Jude, for reflecting on that. We're going to have a question and answer time in a little while, and there's a question for you, Jude, actually, about what you see as being valuable in this great complex trajectory of reconciliation with First Nations people. And you can have a bit of a think about that. The question's in the Q&A box. I'll just flag that for you. And but for both of you, there's just another domain I'd like to explore before we go into that Q&A time in a few minutes. What are some of the things that you experienced, and I know you will have, in seasons of spiritual dryness? The literature about leadership, and anyone who talks about leadership will tell you that there are seasons of great loneliness. And that's certainly been my experience, and I know it has been both of yours. And sometimes accompanying those seasons of loneliness is this experience of drawing from an empty well, what feels like an empty well, and the spiritual dryness, or the dark night of the soul, as the spiritual writers would call it. Kirk, would you like to reflect on that with us, just how you've experienced that perhaps briefly, and what you learnt in those seasons?
Yeah, and look, there's different things that trigger those seasons, because sometimes it can be relational problems with colleagues, for example, where you feel like they've turned against you, or they're what I call white-anting. They're going behind your back and really trying to bring you down, and you seem to be powerless in it. Or it could be, in my experience as well, your board of directors or the people above you who aren't being supportive. Or it can be tiredness. These roles generally are not 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 roles. They go much longer than that. If in the days we could travel, and assuming we will again one day, you might have jet lag, the disconnection from family. Sometimes it's just triggered, a moment. For me, I've got grandkids, and you see your little grandson, and he's just turning 1, and you're on the other side of the world, and you can't even see him, and then it hits you, and then you feel. In my experience, you can feel despondent. You can be angry at God. Why have you put me into this kind of leadership role where it just feels like it's, I don't have control over these things. And so for me, it's been a matter of really learning the spiritual disciplines. I read Richard Foster's spiritual discipline work years ago, and found myself even learning to be just in the quietness. That was one of the most helpful things that I've ever experienced, is just learning to be quiet, even when I feel spiritually dry. Other things like fasting, or certainly daily Bible reading and prayer has always been important for me. I'm not a great prayer. My mind wanders a lot. My wife is an intercessor, and I just watch her with amazement, but I can't do that. But I found these other ways, and they've always rebalanced me. And part of it is the lamenting as well, and really saying, Lord, I really miss my family, or Lord, I'm really sick of this airplane flight. It's 18 hours and it's ground, we're going through a terrible storm. I hate those things. And you're just angry at God, but feeling like you can just do that. And one other thing that's been extremely helpful is to find people, often who I work with, who could be those truth tellers, who could speak into my life or write me and say, Kirk, because often when you're working virtually, it was actually an email. And one guy would write me and say, Kirk, your emails have changed in tone. What's going on? And what he was picking up is actually I was in a bad place spiritually. It was like a wake-up call. And then he'd call me and we would pray. So, not letting myself be isolated, even though it was an isolating kind of role. That requires being open, honest, being humble, telling people you're having a tough time. There's a few times I met with the whole team and said, I've hit a brick wall. I've had it. I'm ready to quit. And, their response was to gather around, lay hands on me and pray for me. And I got up again or took a break or whatever. These kinds of things. So even though we feel isolated and lonely, finding that community of God who can walk with us.
So Kirk, just picking up on that last point, it would seem to me, and certainly it would be consistent with some of the things we read about Jesus and his relationships with those who he was leading, is that vulnerability is actually an incredible strength in leadership if it's accompanied by love and accountability. Jude, have you had an experience, or I'm sure you have, you're smiling, but in your leadership where you've just reached that sort of end of the road and you feel I'm inadequate, there's self-doubt, there's spiritual dryness, there may be anger, lament. How looking back, how did you get through those seasons? Share with us.
Which day were you talking about?
I knew you'd say that. Yeah.
To be honest, I think right at the moment is one of the most difficult times because of the isolation.
Yeah.
Like I'm in a new role. I'm talking to my boss here, everyone. I'm in a new role, a very complex role, and suddenly we're all isolated from each other. And as Kirk was saying, just being able to be open and honest. And I think there was a week ago, wasn't there, Tim, where you said, how are you? And I said, I had a really bad day. And I burst into tears, actually. You might not have noticed that on Zoom, but so actually having people around you is really important. And for me, one of the really important things is having a good life balance. I know that I don't have the biggest tank in the world. And when I get really tired, I don't function. And so not being too hard on myself. Like we can have huge expectations of ourselves as leaders. And particularly at the moment, I think for all of us, there's this need for us to go, hold on a minute, this is an unusual time, and to not be too hard on myself if I can't get everything done. And even just for me, I've got some lovely grandchildren, making it a priority to spend time with them. And there's something about looking at the world through the eyes of an 18-month-old that gives you a whole different perspective on life, and just trying to be thankful to God in the midst of all of that. So trying to find places in my life that are happy and bring me joy. And for me, spending time with my grandkids is probably that place. I'm lucky my grandkids live within 5 kilometres of me, just letting you know. It's important.
So both of you have touched on something that's been true for me as well, and that is that having people, in my case, I'm a fairly high I on the introvert scale, so I tend not to draw life from being around lots of people lots of the time without some quiet. But having people in your world who know you well enough to ask those tough questions because you know they love you, but also within your own team who know where your strengths are, but also where you're not strong. And if you're leading in a diverse setting, your gifts and your skills and your personality may well accomplish a lot, but they will not provide effective leadership for everyone. There'll just be personality clashes, differences of opinion, different agendas, different dynamics going on in the subgroups within your teams. So if you don't have others who've got ears to the ground and are intuitive to some of that, you'll only ever see leadership through the lens that you have. And it will be a slightly or grossly dysfunctional leadership, depending upon the acuity of those things. So that's where what the Bible calls the body of Christ, but we would call in leadership circles just the interdependent team comes in. But it's more than a functional team. It's about those who are walking a journey with you. And when we teach mentoring, Kirk, don't we? We talk about mentoring through this concept of those that have gone ahead of you, those that are walking with you, and those that are coming behind you. And there are men and women in each of those categories that I pray regularly that God will place around me, that I'll see those who've gone before me and seek their wisdom and counsel, that I'll name and recognize and be blessed by those that are walking with me. But I'm also mindful of those that are coming after me and investing in their development and the ministry that God has called them to. So we've got a couple of questions, Jude, and some of you that are listening may have some more. You're very welcome to type them into the Q&A box. The first one, and I'll take this one because it's a question about MST and Eastern College, and we're talking about diversity. You can't really engage in the question of diversity in this day and age without speaking about diversity around questions of gender. And the question itself is, have you had any gay students, whether open or closeted, and how did you manage this? Don't know how you went at Nonalinga, Jude, and Kirk, I would imagine that this has been something that you've had to work with within Wycliffe. Certainly it's been the case at MST and Eastern College. The answer to that would be yes. And what we obviously try to do is to exercise grace and think about these things through the lens of both Scripture and the grace of God. Obviously, a theological college is a place where learning is happening, and what we do try to say to people at MST, and at Eastern would be similar to this, is that we're not necessarily there to tell people what to think, but we do want to help them learn how to think. And that means how to handle the Bible for themselves, how to come to a place of conviction about things around which really godly and mature Christians vehemently disagree. And this would be one of those areas. Yeah. But I've had a number of students over the years that I've spent a lot of time with who are really, really wrestling with this issue. And there are many others. Questions of anxiety and not just gender identity, but actually identity generally, and mental health and all sorts of relationship complexities. And these are the things that, well, they're just ubiquitous, aren't they, in life and society right now. So if we as Christians don't have a role to play in being an encouraging voice into that space, then I'm not sure why we're there. So the answer is yes, we do. And we try to work that through in ways that are sensitive and dignified, but also at the same time, identifying and articulating the convictions that we might hold, even within our team, because there'd be slightly varied convictions around some of these things across our faculty. So yeah, it's a very good question, and thank you for answering that. And let us know if you want to follow up on that any further. Jude, there's another question as well here about Indigenous First Nations people. What do you feel is needed for reconciliation with our Indigenous community? That's
an easy question, isn't it?
That's an easy question.
Look, I think there's a few things that I would say. Firstly, I think we need to understand that it's like saying, how are we going to have reconciliation with Europe, not with Wales? We're talking about vastly different cultures and languages and histories. And so there's no one Indigenous people. And I think that's probably the biggest problem we have in Australia, is that we think, well, we've got second nations, second peoples and first peoples.
Yeah.
But the first peoples are so different to each other. And so the history of connection with dominant culture has significantly changed the way different Aboriginal groups will respond and what their different needs are. So the biggest thing is a one-size-fits-all approach will not work. We've talked about the importance of relationship and actually getting to know and relating to Aboriginal people and spending time is very significant. And that's not always possible for everyone. So I think that there is a huge need for second peoples to be educated. Often we say Aboriginal people need education. Well, I actually think it's the other way around. I think second peoples need education and understanding about the amazingly rich and diverse heritage that we have come along to.
Yeah.
And I think within the church, we have a lot to learn from Aboriginal people who are much closer to biblical cultures than Western culture is.
Yes.
And so if we could be listening to Aboriginal Christians and learning from them, perhaps we might come closer to understanding the Bible ourselves. So, you know, I could talk for 2 hours about this question, but I think not one size fits all. There needs to be relationship, and there needs to be actually allowing Aboriginal people to be saying, well, this is what we would like to have happen.
And Jude, I can take this opportunity to wave your little flag, because we're planning and hoping to develop some units at MST and Eastern College that address this. And it's not just about the sort of cultural conversations that we have in the missiological space. It's actually about an understanding of the way God has designed people and humanity all the way back through Genesis. The diversity of nations that exist because that's how he wants it. And every primary and subculture reflects in its own DNA aspects of God's character and grandeur. Every culture in its DNA also reflects evil and dysfunction and those things that are raised against God. And navigating through some of that is the most fascinating and helpful exercise. And you wouldn't even be able to teach a class in a school in Australia anymore without coming across the challenge of diversity, of worldview and culture and values, all of these things that we're talking about today. So thinking about them through the lens of leadership is a really, really helpful way to approach them. So they're really good questions. Thank you for that. And so keep your eyes on the curriculum and the listings of units at Eastern and MST over the next couple of years, because we are very passionate about this and exploring the introduction of some units that are going to address this a little bit more closely. And I think, just looking at our Q&A box, we are pretty close to emptying our questions. So Jude or Kirk, or Jude and Kirk, how about I just ask both of you to reflect on something that God has blessed you by in your leadership, you know, in the stewardship of leadership. What is one thing that you look back and just give thanks to God for, in spite of the challenges, in spite of those seasons of wanting to run away and hide in a cave, in spite of the sense of isolation or self-doubt, feeling overwhelmed, Jude, I think many of us and those that are listening right now probably dance around some of that even now in this COVID season. And yet at the same time, if we choose to, can find in this season space to be quiet and a realignment of priorities, a sense of self-examination. Am I outcomes driven in my life? What if I couldn't move and get out? What if something happened to me and this was to be my life? Could I find joy in my relationship with my family and friends or in God? So as you look back, Jude, on your leadership, what are some of the, perhaps what's one thing that you are just really thankful for?
I think just the opportunity to meet and learn from Indigenous people. My favourite thing at Noongalinga was chapel times, where we would be reading the Bible and praying in different languages. Aboriginal people would be dancing. That's a very distinctive form of worship that they have. And just this amazing, everything was really simple. We didn't have to make things too complicated. Everything was simple, focused on Jesus. And I remember just having a really great sense of God's presence in the midst of that and their great joy, despite the incredible suffering that they brought.
Yeah.
It changed my life and gave me a whole different perspective.
Yeah, that's lovely, Jude. Thank you. What about you, Kirk?
Yeah, well, what comes to mind is in the course of this global role, there was a number of times where there was some deep organizational crisis in majority world countries where Western partners had made certain decisions and judgment calls and all, and no one was listening to the majority world leaders. And in several cases, I went physically, one time to Nigeria, India, and other places. I shouldn't even name them because then you're seeing which kind of countries. But these were very complex situations. And working it through and listening and praying and often not knowing what to do, but by making a decision that seemed right, the best for them. But then as I was leaving this role recently, to have those people reach out to me and remember that time, could have been 8 years ago in some cases, some were 10 years ago, and remember the conversation and remember what I did and remember what I said and how much they were grateful because it got them out of that crisis, turned the whole organization around, and they were able to continue their ministry. If they hadn't reached out, I would have long forgotten that I even had that kind of impact. I certainly didn't know what I was doing at the time, but obviously God was using me. I think it's whenever we have those testimonies of people reminding us of the impact we've had simply because we showed up and were faithful is really encouraging, and it really keeps you going and keeps me going.
And just as a closing thought, if I was asked the same question, I think for me, it has been the overwhelming sense of privilege that in spite of myself and the inadequacies and the sense along the way of perhaps being thrown in the deep end, in looking in the rearview mirror and seeing just the work of God in people's lives. And that's true now as we're involved at MST and Eastern College, and we see people's lives being transformed every day. And it's like, wow, you've given me the opportunity to serve these people in leadership. And it was true in my season in global mission leadership, and to see the power of God at work in ways that we don't tend to see here in Australia very often, in remarkable movements and transformation, and huge numbers of people choosing to trust Christ out of places of suffering. And it's very hard to forget that. And so an older wise guy once said to me, don't doubt in the dark what you knew to be true in the light. Or in other words, reflect on God's goodness and that he does use people. He uses people in leadership. And It's one of the great conundrums of the spiritual life, that God chooses to use people to declare his glory. But that's what Colossians says, isn't it? Christ in you, the hope of glory. So look, thank you for joining us this evening. If you're interested a little more in some of this stuff, as we said, I think Iona's put some notes there in the chat room about some units that are coming up in the summer in missional leadership. I'm teaching one in leadership and management. That's at an undergraduate level. So check those out if you like, and send us some notes if you've got some more questions to ask. And tomorrow, I think Tom Kimber is going to be exploring the question of how does COVID-19 impact the shape and direction of church. That will be really interesting. So I'm looking forward to that. So God bless you all. Thank you so much for coming. And hopefully we'll hear from some of you before too long. Good night.